let's just start with our very basic question that I really ask all of our guests, which is, what is your evolution of race consciousness? And just for our audience, who maybe have never heard that question before, the reason I ask that, everybody, is because we all living in a society where there is a racial hierarchy, where a racial hierarchy has been intertwined with our systems of power and our societal structures and our social environment. There usually comes a time where people kind of gain some kind of either awareness or curiosity about said hierarchy, or they recognize that it exists. And if you go to my YouTube channel and look at the poem Contraband of Race War, it's a poem I wrote and animation I commissioned to go along with it that kind of explains my own personal one. So I always am interested in finding out what other people's is, because you learn a lot that way. So, Josh, what about you and your evolution of race consciousness?
It was long overdue, I guess, would be the best thing to say. I spent probably the first 25 years of my life running from my culture and my background for various reasons, which I'm sure we'll get into. And it was kind of a sudden awakening, honestly, that really made me look at myself and look at where I came from and where my family came from, and really just decide, hey, something about me doesn't feel right in regards to the community I'm currently keeping. What is it? And then just kind of doing a little bit of introspection, I realized I wasn't embracing the thing that made me or my family us. And that was our heritage. That was being Mexican. That was being specifically Mexican indigenous, which I'll get into a little later. Finding that out, and it's just it kind of slapped me in the face, honestly, with how much I a ran away from it, and b just didn't know, which I probably should have, but I'm making up for lost time now.
Well, let's kind of dig into the like probably should have part a little bit, because ultimately you didn't, right? And so like whether you should have or shouldn't have, like let's figure out like why do you think that happened? And in addition to that, I guess it goes hand in hand. Like, what kind of identity did you hold about yourself, if any, ethnically or racially, before you had your awakening?
um the identity I really had was, I guess, for lack of a better word, just American, as as vague of a term as that is for specifically people of color. I was just American. My dad was a Marine, and he was very, you know, uh, uh, um, about the country and very proud of the country and how he served. And that kind of trickled down to me and my siblings. We weren't, I wasn't out there, you know, waving flags or anything like that, but I would always identify myself as American first and foremost. But thinking about it, that identity only came about because of the running away from my culture that I did. So they kind of feed into each other. I only identified as one thing because the other thing I didn't feel comfortable with identifying as, for various reasons. And eventually that became bitterness because of the backlash that I got for not identifying or fully embracing my heritage, fully embracing being Mexican. And I became very bitter about it, and very, I don't need a heritage. A I don't need to worry about where my ancestors were from to be complete as a person, to be whole as a person, to have a personality or identity. And now I realize that that's partially true. I feel like that's partially true, and I feel like that is something that can feed into your development as a personality, rather than just being the sole basis of it, which is what I, again, being bitter, um focused on, was that, oh, these people identify as Mexican, and that's all they identify as. They have nothing else. I don't want that. I'm not going to be that, which was just me being honestly ignorant, and not allowing myself to get to know these people and know how their heritage affected their personality and how they built up off of that.
Interesting, interesting. All right, so let's fast forward to your awakening. Like, what was that awakening for you? And kind of describe your thoughts and emotions during that time when you were like changing your perspective on this and you're like, you know what, American is not enough for me. What happened?
Yeah, for a lot of people that I've talked to, we all kind of have a similar story, which is like the rise of Trumpism and 2016 and everything surrounding the election really was the catalyst for me deciding, hey, I should probably look into who I am and where I came from. And specifically, the moment I specifically remember was I was helping a friend move, and um, she was white, and her father, she went off to get food for us while we were moving. So we were taking a break, and I had a great relationship with these people. They were friendly. I had open invites to their homes for every, holiday, birthday cards, Christmas cards, everything. It was, they really meant a lot to me. And I remember talking to her father while she was gone. We were just having a really general conversation that we normally do. And Trump came up. And at the time, her father felt the way a lot of people who voted for him the first time did, which was, yeah, he's kind of done some messed up things, but like maybe an outsider is what we need, maybe someone different, that kind of thinking. And like, in hindsight, it's dismissive of everything that happened and everything that he has done or did. And then whenever I brought up the fact that I brought up the all of this hatred that he was spewing about Mexicans, illegal immigrants, um, people like that, I brought that up to him. I said, well, if he and people of his ilk had their way, I would probably be at risk of being deported, even though I was born here, because that's just how much they want us out. And then he looked at me and he said, and this still sticks with me, he said, oh, I'm sure they would make an exception for people like you. He basically, you're one of the good ones to me. And that like just burned into my brain. Like I was just, it was one of those moments where I was so taken aback by what happened. I didn't even really like process it until later. She's like, oh, yeah, that that happened. And it just kind of stewed in my head the entire time. But I just pushed on. We finished moving. And then later that night, I went home and I called my friend and I said, hey, this is the conversation I had with your dad. It really made me feel uncomfortable, this and that. And she just threw out, you know, maybe he didn't mean it like that, or, stuff like that. Just be very dismissive of my feelings and of how it affected me. And that was in the summer of 2016. And to this day, I haven't spoken to her or any member of that family since. And that was the day that I realized maybe I'm doing something wrong with how I present myself to people. Because no matter what I do, I'm never going to be one of them. And I think, especially when I was younger, one of them is what I was trying to be because I was running from my culture so much.
Wow. Okay. So you have this experience where someone basically tells you you're one of the good ones, puts you in the good box, and everybody, other Mexicans in the bad box,
Yeah.
apparently. And that kind of makes you realize, oh, this is how it happens. Like I'm
Yep.
literally, literally giving divvied up like I'm a piece of the good meat, you
Hmm.
know. And yeah, so then you decide that what kind of did you decide after that you wanted to you got obviously got curious about your own identity and your own past, so I think you started investigating that, right?
Yeah, I got angry. I got angry and I started kind of exploring my heritage and where I came from out of spite, really. Because that situation felt so insulting to me and my family that I was just like, well, I know your family's history. I know where your family came from. Why does this place mean more to you than it does to me or to my family? My dad, who, like I said, served in the Marine Corps, served in Vietnam. That doesn't matter just because, of our heritage, just because of our skin color. So I got angry and I started just delving into it as much as I can. Now, the easiest way that I did it was culture. I don't know if maybe it was just I was like dipping my toe into it at first, but it was culture. It was music, film, television, books, stuff like that. And that was really a big, like, that opened the floodgates for me. Once I found that, I was just like, oh, here's this media that I can consume, that even if I didn't connect with it on a personal level, I could connect with it on, an ethnic level, or even just it makes me feel something that other media didn't quite give to me. And I remember when I was in high school, I went to Mexico with a friend and his family, and I had never been to Mexico before. And I also had, as far as I know, even to this day, I don't know how much of a connection our family has to Mexico. So I never had any reason to go. So I went with my friend and his family, and when I was there, I like felt something, but I was like 15 or 16, so I didn't really have the tools to process what it was. And to be honest, I don't even know if I have those tools now to really, figure that out. But I felt something and I just ignored it because I was still bitter at the time. So I just moved on. And then once that situation happened with my friend's father, I just got angry and I said, all right, that's how you feel. I've been palatable I've been palatable for white people for so long. Um, that's gonna stop now because, as I said at the beginning of this rant, no matter what I do, I'm never gonna be one of them. And when it comes down to it, I will always be different. So why not lean into it and have, FU energy?
Palatable to white people. When we first talked, that was such a interesting phrase that you used there. Like, I was wondering, I can't remember if we talked about this originally or not, but were there any examples that you could think of about like being palatable to white people, or like a time where like you noticed that that was something that was a part of your existence, like in your everyday life?
Um, it's not really so much one point or one example, honestly. I think it's the example of assimilation that a lot of specifically children of immigrants have, which I'm not. I'm not a child of immigrants, but I was still able to feel it because I was running from my culture and everything about it. Everything that I consumed and displayed about myself was from other cultures. So I didn't really have like an example of when it happened. It was everything all the time, constantly. Like, it was the music I liked. It was the way I dressed. It was the way, I mean, I've I have painted fingernails. That for the longest time, people, fellow people of color, just always looked at me weird for doing that. And I would be called, I'd get saying, why are you doing that? That's, that stuff white boys do. And it's just like, well, it's me. I enjoy it. And there are certain aspects of making myself more palatable to white people that that like now I've after doing the work I realized, okay, some of it was making myself more palatable, some of it is just me. I paint my nails because I like painting my nails. I like the way it looks. I like the way it makes my hands look. Other things, specifically, we might get into it. My lack of Spanish language knowledge was making myself more palatable from being in situations where, you know, someone is speaking Spanish. There's, and this is not going to make me look good, but that's kind of what I'm here for. There were times where I would be almost invited into the club of my my friend, or who's white or even non-white. Other people I've been friends with have done this too. Hearing someone speaking Spanish and kind of looking at me like going like, "Can you get a load of this speaking Spanish here?" And like I took part in that, and I was you know ignorant to that. So it was just it wasn't really a few things. It was constantly. It was pretty much just the way I live my life on a daily basis, making myself more palatable for non-Mexicans, and running away from my culture as fast as I can. And I have short legs, so I can't run very fast. But
Now, one thing that we had talked about is that as you were learning more and more, you kind of realized that there were some connections between the history of Mexican immigrants and white supremacy, and that there was
mhm.
some overlap there. So, can you talk a little bit about what you discovered through your investigation?
Yeah, a lot of what I found out really had to do with um, the anti-blackness in the Mexican community that I probably knew was there, but just couldn't tell, just couldn't really see the signs of it. And that my mother, but going back to my mom, she identifies as Chicano, which is a American-born Mexican. Now, in the '60s, there was the Chicano movement that was kind of spurned alongside the civil rights movement. But the Chicano movement imploded, and it imploded for a couple of reasons. It imploded because there was still a heavy patriarchal and sexist kind of ideal wrapped up in this fight for civil rights among them. But also, the basis for their fight was fighting against the white passing Mexicans who didn't have to deal with their struggles, who didn't have to deal with the lower education, who didn't have to deal with the lower jobs, being in poorer neighborhoods, stuff like that. But instead of mm, instead of fighting for intersectionality in their civil rights, they fought for being separated from the white passing Mexicans, but still not claiming black Mexicans. So they still try, instead of they would say, we're not white passing Mexicans, we are not white Mexicans, we are brown Mexicans, but we're still not like them over there. And the more I read up about it, the more I realized, oh, it white supremacy still permeates all facets of Mexican culture. I mean, there's videos on YouTube that you can look up about why, how light skinned a lot of the novela actors are, and how, how, like, and that's for so many different cultures. You look at Bollywood, a lot of Bollywood films, and there's so many light skinned actors. You look at, Filipinos, stuff like that. There's the light skinned people are more easily marketable, more easily accessible, and that alone pushes these white supremacy ideals. And when it comes to Mexico, my father's side of the family is from Veracruz, which is a port city, and had was a part of the slave trade, and a big outpost for that. And reading up on Veracruz and all everything that happened there, a lot of the um slaves that came there were still, and eventually made their way north or anything like that, will and claim themselves as Mexicans, were still seen as less than. We're still seen as not Mexican. Yeah, they're not Mexican enough. You can't be Mexican because you're black. Even the children of these people were never going to be seen as Mexican because they're black. And that really showed me just how pervasive this anti-blackness is. And it's something that a lot of Mexicans even today don't want to talk about. I have friends whose families love Spain and Spanish culture and love, everything that came from Spain. So much so that it almost seems like they're looking at Spain as like the superior form of, Spanish speakers. And that as I learn more about it, it really has started to, piss me off, honestly,
It,
because it's getting back to my indigenous, side. It is just paying homage to um, colonialism, and that's really upsetting.
I just wanted to point that out as well because a lot of people don't understand, um, how people come to conclusions in this context,
Yeah,
how you can make relations in this context. And really, it's just like this having these conversations, realizing the overlap between your experiences and between, the dialogues that you've had with people of different races, throughout your life. And there's so much overlap, there's tons of patterns. And that's kind of one way that you can understand the depth of these problems, as you mentioned before. So,
as long as it's in good faith, as long as it's in good faith.
100%. I mean, that's a must. Yeah, that's a must have. You were a registered Republican. Is that correct?
Sorry, yes, I was.
Yeah.
Um,
Tell us about your transition from that because I'm gonna go ahead and guess, given you live in Florida and given your comments on my posts regarding the Florida standards of education and our conversation thus far, I don't think it's a stretch to say that you're no longer a Republican.
no, that is not a stretch, but I was a registered Republican because I viewed it solely as the way the difference between Democrats and Republicans were taught to me, which is Democrats, big government, Republicans, small government. And being from Chicago, I've always had like uh I guess a bitterness, like a little brother syndrome when it comes to the coasts. There's coastal bias, and people who don't think so, they're wrong. Sorry. But
Oh no, I agree. Just to put my vote for the record. Yeah, there definitely is 100%.
and when I was younger, I always thought to myself, well, why do I want, people in from New York City or Los Angeles were, making choices for us here in Chicago? So I thought, smaller government, we can focus on more issues locally. That's what I'll do. That was the basis of my being a registered Republican. Smaller government, Chicago can make, and Illinois can make choices for Chicago and Illinois. Right around my my very first presidential election, that flipped. That was 2008. That was my first presidential election that I was able to vote in. That flipped, and it didn't flip very hard, but at least by 2012, it flipped real hard. And to be fair, as a registered Republican, I've never once voted Republican. So I don't know how much of a registered Republican I don't know how much of a Republican I ever was outside of wanting the smaller government. But then before I had ever like fully made the switch and became a registered Democrat, seeing all of these people who, were carrying the flag for the Republican Party, I started to slowly realize, oh, they want my vote, but they don't give a crap about me. They want my vote, but they want me gone. I was born here. It doesn't matter to them. They want me gone. Why am I going to do that? Unfortunately, there's still a lot of specifically Latinos who feel like that and are willing to vote that way and are willing to ignore that for various reasons. I couldn't do it
And
anymore, and
hang
I
on
had to stop.
before you go on there, like just a side note on that. For anyone who's questioning that narrative that they want him gone, I just want to say one thing because there are people who, try to pretend like there aren't minutes and minutes of clips of Donald Trump, saying negative things about immigrants and Mexicans particularly, and and degrading them and dehumanizing them.
Yeah.
But we actually had a guest on the show a while back. A friend of mine, her son, she is racialized white, and her husband is Mexican, and they have a son together. And he was in the cafeteria of his middle school, and a kid stood up, and he pretended like he was calling Donald Trump, and said, "Hey Trump, we've got an illegal here. We need you to send ICE out." And everybody was laughing, but like he was scared, and he like didn't really understand the nature of what was going on. And so he came back. Obviously his mother and myself, who have watched this kid grow up, like, were upset about that. And we spoke with the school, to their credit, handled it well. Overall, I still think that they probably should have done a little bit more on the side of educating the student and the parents. But in terms of
Yeah.
protecting the this kid, they did a good job of that, at least.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's becoming much more of an upward battle, in terms of being able to trust the school or the district or the state to handle those kind of situations as best as possible, even in non-red states. So it's rough, and yeah, for anyone who thinks that that narrative is wrong, um, you're wrong, and I don't like you. Like, I'm not gonna mince words. You're wrong, and I don't like you. Sorry.
Inheritances are something you get whether you want it or not.
Yeah.
So like, I think people's feelings about inheritances are totally legitimate. Whatever you feel, like, I mean, it's your feelings. Like, you're allowed to have them, but like, I think it's important to just remember that, like, all you can do is what you can do from that point, which is like, you have this inheritance,
Yeah.
like, this is your legacy. And so from there, then you make a choice, and like, you're right. I think that whatever choice people make, that should be honored, right? If somebody doesn't want to integrate their identity, their ethnic or cultural or racial identity, into their comedy, then they shouldn't be forced to do that, or their audience shouldn't be primed to expect them to do that. And
Hmm.
we shouldn't create an environment where there's an expectation of doing that. So I'm totally with you on that. But if somebody does, then they should be allowed to do it, and there shouldn't be anything
Absolutely.
wrong with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just feel like creators who are kind of forcibly pushed into that niche it's unfair to them because it's not allowing them to be fully creative. If someone like, like Guillermo del Toro, he's amazing director, and he has a masterful blend of his culture of being Mexican and using it in ways that will pay homage to it, or have it, um what's the word I'm looking for? Have it kind of accentuate things, or because he'll tell a story about a Victorian Gothic romance that takes place in Europe, or I think it takes place in Europe. I haven't seen it in a long time. But there are still aspects of the story, or of the character design, or the storytelling, or the music. Maybe there's like a piece of the score that is reminiscent of something, of like a Mexican lullaby or something like that. And he always finds ways to marry the two, and it's brilliant, and he's fantastic at it. And I feel like if he was just told, yeah, maybe you should like go tell more stories about Mexican people, we would be robbed of so many good things. But that only happens to artists of color. No one is going to, I don't know, Steven Spielberg. I don't know what he is. I don't know if he's Irish or German or whatever. And telling him, yeah, Spielberg, go make more movies about those, about your heritage. We don't need Jaws. You just leave Jaws to someone else. Go make more stories about you. It's always make people of color always have to deal with other people telling them to make stories in about their people, about their struggle. And it's really unfair to creators. And it's something I'm kind of actively trying to push back against. If you look at my YouTube channel, I have one video that really talks about my heritage in any way, shape, or form. And that's kind of on purpose.
So tell us, what is your focus in comedy? What do you like talking about? What do you like joking about?
Uh my family has a very dark but silly sense of humor. Um so I try and marry those two. I was just thinking I was actually I think I remember I had mentioned this to my brother a little while ago that The Simpsons is probably my single biggest comedic influence. And there's a silliness and a heart that not only The Simpsons but some of my other favorite comedies marry and marry well. Something like The Simpsons or Scrubs or um I mean this is like in the complete opposite direction, but a show like Barry is incredibly funny, incredibly dark, and I think it's like one of the best shows ever made. So my humor is really based in silliness, but not being afraid of what other people may deem as dark. And I don't mean in like an edgy kind of, oh, I don't like PC politically correctness kind of thing, but in just a, hey, making a funny joke about death or something like that shouldn't be bad. It just all depends on how you do it. If it's clever, if it's good, then you can get away with it. If it's not, it just comes off as crass. And that's something that I really try to keep in mind whenever I'm writing.
Very nice, very nice. I think that's a pretty good way of doing things in comedy. You know, I never really gotten to ask a comedian that question. That was a great answer, and I never really heard anyone talk about it that way either. So thank you for sharing that. That's really important. We got some questions here. One from Bothered Boy here. How can we with Latin American heritage fight back against patriarchy in our communities? Any answer for that?
Oh man, that's a good question. That's something I've like I think a lot of I think a lot of Latinos don't want to admit that the patriarchy is a thing. And I think that until that happens, there's not really much we can do. And that's really sad to say. It's really sad to say that, well, they don't understand it, so we can't do anything about it. But it's such an uphill battle because it's so ingrained in, I mean, I'm just speaking from, a Mexican point of view. It's so ingrained in Mexican culture, you know, that it, it's really ruining a lot of the younger generations because if you're the child of an immigrant and you are more aware of the patriarchal struggles that people deal with on a daily basis and you're willing to try and change it, you still have to fight against this traditional way of thinking that is so ingrained in your family and your friends' families that it almost just feels like you're drowning trying to change them. And a lot of it also has to go back to the media. A lot of media, both Spanish speaking media and American media, like to portray Latinos and Latino men as macho and ladies men and in like overly sexual beings, which happens to black men and black characters as well. And I think Spanish speaking media has to start doing that as well because we can't, especially talking to the younger generations, they can't do it on their own. They're fighting too much of an uphill battle. That kind of thinking is so ingrained in it, and it also, and this is something that Mexicans also don't like to hear. It also goes hand in hand with their kind of, I don't want to say reliance on, but their devotion to religious practices and religious hierarchies. It's all wrapped up together. So what can we do? Reach out to as many young people as you can and try and break it that way. I mean, I, the whole red pill, Andrew Tate loving people, it really frustrates me how a lot of leftist content creators make what I like to call bro that sucks content, which is Andrew Tate comes out and says something ridiculous and hateful and, sexist, racist, whatever. And instead of trying to do something about it, it's just, bro, that sucks. How could he say that? That's awful. Can you believe this guy? That's crazy. All right, next clip. It's so superficial and it's really, really bothering me because these kind of reactions are coming from people who are moral guides for a lot of young leftists. So whenever they don't do anything about it, it's just, cool, they dunked on him. All right, what's next? I'm a comedian. My job is to make someone laugh. I'm starting to feel like more and more that I and others like me are going to need to start making content and really actively reaching out to younger generations to try and break that because it's not happening by just sitting back and dunking on people.
Yeah, I could definitely agree with that. The dunking, the I won mentality that's so pervasive out there about the littlest things, like, is not very helpful in that regard for sure. But yeah, and you're right, media plays a huge role. I just want to mention one thing that we kind of talked about in the chat here. Ultimately, it's got to be, all of these isms have to be attacked at multiple dimensions, multiple levels. And so if you're wondering what to do on the interpersonal level, really, ultimately, you just got to start with your small sphere of influence and with your own family, with your own friends. And that can be very difficult and feel very much like you're drowning, like you mentioned before. And it can also feel very isolating if you're going against this huge wave of, something like patriarchy, which is as ingrained as you mentioned before. But that is a great place to start, as difficult as it is, as fearful as you might be about doing it, because ultimately that is your locus of control, all right, is your friends and family. And the people you encounter on a day-to-day basis. So that's how I started with, my conversations on race, guys. Like, I would talk to people in my everyday life, fellow instructors, students, principals, people I met sitting next to them at the bar, at an art exhibit, at brunch, everywhere you can imagine. That's where I did it.
Yeah, I think there's a few things that you kind of have to balance whenever you do that as well, which is you have to be able to balance informing someone without preaching to them, which a lot of people don't have the skill to do. But you also, if you're serious about it, if you're serious about pushing back against it and trying to change things, you can't be afraid to piss people off. If you, like, I regularly, post stuff on my social media or my YouTube channel that's like, hey, if you are a transphobe or anything like that, don't care how much money you give me, don't care how much you watch my videos, I don't want you here. You have to be willing to deal with that if you really want to be able to push that change, because the moment you start thinking, well, I kind of want to talk to them about this, but they might get mad at me and they might, stop talking to me or whatever like that. Well, you have to decide whether you're willing to allow them to perpetuate hate or ignorance just for your comfort. And if you're not willing to push that, then I don't know how important you're going to be to whatever issue you're trying to change.
I think that's a great way of putting it. You got to make a choice. And that's really what the Contraband Wagon is all about in the race context, is getting people to the point where they actually can make an informed choice. Because a lot of people know nothing about this subject matter. They rarely talk or think about it. And so ultimately it's trying to create a space so that more people can become educated, more people can start thinking critically about issues of race and identity and the world in which you live and what it all means and what your place in it is, so that you can then make that choice. And whatever choice you make, it's your personal choice, it's your decision. But you need to make it and stop avoiding it. A lot of people avoid, willfully or not. So we got some more questions here I want to get to here. So we've got one from NYXCPYXI. I don't know how to say that, but
Nixie Pixie.
okay. I have a question for the guest. Speaking on having indigenous heritage and not speaking Spanish, that is an experience I share. Has there ever been a point where you feel you're not, quote, brown enough because you don't adhere to what people think of when they hear that you're Mexican? And how do you reconcile that with now finding ways to no longer be palatable? I assume he means palatable to white people.
Yeah. I talked about my bitterness towards my heritage and, my own people when I was younger. And a lot of that had to do with my lack of Spanish language knowledge. And the interactions I would have would usually go like this. I would meet someone, let's say like the family member of a friend, and they would greet me in Spanish, and I would say, as very politely with a smile on my face, I'm sorry, I don't speak Spanish. And this brightness that was in their face is gone. And there's this mixture of disappointment and confusion that takes over their face. And I would invariably get some form of a question of, you don't speak Spanish? Well, why? And I never knew how to answer that question. I never knew how to answer that question because I didn't want to say, because I didn't want to say I was ashamed of being Mexican or ashamed of speaking Spanish, which sounds heavy, but there were times when I was. And a lot of my bitterness came from my interactions with like that. And in hindsight, it's really because these people who are, let's say they are immigrants. Let's say they are Mexican immigrants and they came here to build a life, and they hold this culture and where they're from so dear that when they see someone who they identify with, this person's Mexican, they're one of my people, and they see me not, I guess I don't want to say playing to the stereotypes because that sounds negative, but I'm not playing into what they expect. It almost feels like I broke their heart, because they've strived so much to come to this country and keep a hold of their culture that, let's face it, a lot of this country wants to strip them of and quiet or just outright get rid of. And I just feel like they look at me and they're just so heartbroken that I'm not connected with it. And all of my interactions like that made me feel so not Mexican enough. But that was all my own doing. I can't honestly say that there's ever been a time where I felt like that, where it wasn't my own fault, because I was running away.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So last question here. This is from Elion, and it says, "Do you think the pressure of society making lighter skin desirable influenced your sexual preferences?" I'll answer that first. All right. Thanks, Beta Boy. Appreciate you, brother. Take care. So for me, 100% for sure, but like it wasn't pressure from whiteness, like, or anything like that. It's more insidious than that. So literally, like, it's not like I had to sit and think about it. Like, I grew up I was a very intelligent kid. I was in classes with almost all white people for most of my educational career. I didn't do sports where I would typically be around other black kids, and most black kids were not in my classes. So I was around mostly white people, and I continued my education that way. I went to graduate school. I went to law school. So like in all of those environments, I was mostly surrounded by white people. Of course, I would find pockets of black people and other people, to commune with. And of course, I had my life outside of academia, but that was a big part of my life, right? So I would say that there was a very particular moment that I can recall. Um, I was not attracted to other black people. Like, I was like, and then there was a very specific moment that I recall where I was like, that's kind of weird. Like, I am black, like I was like, so I'm saying like I wouldn't even be attracted to myself. And like, as soon as I thought that, it was like my lack of attraction to black people was like gone. And I'm not exaggerating. Like, as soon as I had that thought, like, whatever made me not attracted to black people was gone, like forever.
Wow.
Right. And so, like, there was definitely something deep going on in there. But as soon as I actually thought about it consciously, which was the first time I ever did, it was gone. So,
Wow.
very scary that some kind of inception clearly happened to me. And I just kind of assumed it was natural and normal. And that's where the whiteness and the normality of whiteness or whatever comes into
Hmm.
play, because I never questioned it. So yeah, it took me many years to question it. As soon as I did, yeah, that's when I was like, oh man, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. And also, like, my mind clearly knows that, and so does everything else.
Yeah. Mine, it wasn't necessarily, so I'm gonna say no, but it did affect my, I guess, my dating habits, my dating preferences, because, and I think I mentioned it earlier, me being a straight guy with painted nails and everything like that, to women of color, I was always kind of a little suspicious to them. I was always given a little side eye. Why do you have your nails painted? Guys aren't supposed to do that. So I kind of ran from the women of color that I was interested in. Whereas the, white women that I was interested in, they were okay with it. I was, kind of allowed, quote unquote, to be myself. So I started dating mainly white women. And that was more of me, again, running for my culture, but also me being insecure about myself. I don't have that issue anymore. And if someone doesn't, regardless of their skin color, regardless of where, their culture, their heritage, if they don't accept me for who I am, doesn't bother me much. But I do know that I have, friends who are, part of the LGBTQ community who ran from their sexuality because of their own community. I have a friend um who's trans, who is still scared to tell their family because she's from a conservative black household. One of my best friends growing up was gay, and he didn't tell his family for the longest time because they're a conservative Mexican family. So they ran for it for that reason, but they didn't necessarily run because of um the want for the mixing with lighter skin. But I can see how that absolutely would be pushed, especially in Mexican communities, because like I said, there are white supremacist Mexicans out there. So the lighter your skin, the better you are. And if you come from a family of a lot of dark skinned people who really adhere to that belief system, they're going to push you to date someone lighter, regardless of how dark you are, because to them, that's better.
All right, and there you have it. Thanks, Josh. This was a really enlightening and excellent conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time out. Really appreciate it. Yeah, hope to have you back in the future, brother, and stay in touch. All right.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who showed up. And yeah, I'll be back anytime you want me to.
Why don't you tell everybody where they can find your work and get you on social?
Yeah. Lost Doctor 312 on pretty much everything.